journeying up here with the sounds of Bruckner's 9 conducted by Joachim, I had all the time in the world to think about what I was going to ask, which was wonderful. However, I also had all the time in the world to forget about what it was. And so to the sound of Bruckner's blaring trumpets, this is Benjamin Martin, and this is Ragtime. I feel not just honoured but deeply touched to be able to present to you a very special guest today, someone I've known over the course of my entire life, and indeed he was a great friend of my late mother and father. He also conducted my debut concerto appearance with Grieg's Concerto when I was 12 years old with the Kew Philharmonic, and really it would be difficult to overestimate just how much this person has contributed in terms of art and culture, and more than that, in terms of Australian society. He was a teacher of philosophy and indeed composition at La Trobe for many, many years. But really, he is one of the most deeply thoughtful, feeling, with a mind of tremendous perspicacity, unusual in that way, and a true philosopher with not just a philosophical disposition, but perspicacity of mind, a very strong scientific orientation as well, and with a tremendous understanding of the medicinal side of things as well. So, Melvyn Cann, very pleased to have you on board and to chat with you. We were talking just before about this business of the pace of any conversation that might be had today. And Melvyn, rightly, I think, was saying how people, even of my generation, I'm not so young, but and the younger generation are now adapted to this very quick pace of sort of, I call it from the hip, talking, like a ready response and all ready to go. And I personally, I didn't say this to Melvyn, I wanted to be able to say it here so we can get things off to an interesting start. We can take a mind like Christopher Hitchens, for example, who had a very, very sharp mind, theatrically extremely entertaining. However, to me, this is not necessarily a first-rate thinker, as brilliant as he was. And I think nowadays people have unfortunately conflated great thinking with the speed of delivery in terms of debate for television and radio and so forth, whereas some of the greatest thinkers would seem very slow today. That includes someone like Carl Jung, who you can even see on YouTube. And that's because they're always thinking, they're always rethinking, they're always doubting, but indeed their mind is working over at a terrific speed. But they are very, very careful to do justice and integrity to their inner processes. So, Melvyn, I wonder if you might have some thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, Ben, for your kind words, and let's hope I merit some of them at least in this podcast. And I congratulate you on the initiative, taking this step. Yes, well, I'm just in the process of writing an article for a book which suggests that music is the central theme in everybody's life, one way and another, and it merits a great deal of attention to the way in which music functions in a particular society. But I don't want to sound too academic in that way. I listened, Ben, to your first, is it just 3 podcasts you've done?
So far, 5, but 2 of them very short with just me doing solo.
Well, I've listened to 3, and I thought to pick up 1 or 2 of the threads that you teased out in those. One is the question of the unknown. Now, I can't disagree with the drift of what you want to try and communicate with that, but there is some curious kind of double bind in saying that we don't know the unknown, because if we didn't know that there is an unknown, and therefore if the unknown is not actually known, because we know it's there, we know that some kind of unifying creative force presence is there in us, and we as creative artists, that's our job, is to develop that. I've just been thinking this morning the biblical phrase from Genesis, and Adam knew Eve, and she bare Cain. Adam knew Eve, and she bare Abel. Now these days we have a dreadful swear word that abounds all over the place, describing the act of love which creates another human being, the most extraordinary thing. And in that biblical text, it's described as a form of knowledge or of knowing. And if it's to be understood at all, it's a kind of intimacy, the intimacy of lovers, and in the theology that God is love and so on, our quest for God and the soul or whatever, the big questions we ask about life, we sense there's something there. It's obvious that we do. I mean, you start to talk to anyone about it, and they'll talk about a wonderful feeling at a sunset or something like that, when they just feel absorbed into the whole of nature and become unified and intimate with the whole of being.
Sure. Well, my point with that talk, though, just to be sure from my own perspective, was my concern was that we want to drive out any sense that there is anything unknown. That very real sense, as you say, there's an awareness that there is an unknown, which is a sort of tautology, but at the same time, I think there's this unconscious tendency to want to just abandon any sense that there even is anything unknown. And as someone like the neo-Darwinist Richard Dawkins reminds us many times, however much percentage, 97, 98% of everything is known, and there's only a very small amount.
Yes. Well, I'm not offering any kind of argument against anything you said, and I did recognise the kind of targets that you were looking at, aiming at. But just this question of intimacy. Well, I'll start at a different point. I mean, I've already started, but I'll jump to a different point. I'm inclined to think that way, and recently I did a test on the web to see whether I was suffering from ADHD, and I found that I was really high on the score for ADHD.
Well done.
And I thought, this
that gives me something to look forward to as well. I'll do that test when I'm a little older.
Well, and I thought about it, because I thought, well, now, who above all people I know seems to be capable of concentrating on really long tasks focusing on them for a long period of time? But then I realised that, yes, my mind does jump around from all over the place, and I tend to lead. Well, I'm very much an improviser these days, on the piano particularly. I've done a lot of improvisational performances and recordings, and improvising is about accepting at every moment, whatever you do, you haven't got time like my philosophical colleagues used to have. If they were delivering a paper, they'd say, well, on the other hand, having just said that, I think I might have to think about this proposition that so-and-so, I might have to revise a bit of that. You can't stop in the middle of a Brahms performance of a Brahms sonata and say, look, I'm sorry, audience, I didn't like the way I played that G minor chord a few bars back. I'm just going to go back and do it again and do it better, you know.
May I say something on that point you said about your mind jumping around?
Yeah.
I just wonder if that's just not a consequence of living the examined life and just a self-awareness, whereas perhaps most people, their mind jumps all over the place, but they're just not aware of it internally.
Yes.
Maybe, right?
Well, maybe. I do crave sometimes to regard myself as normal. I could describe my life as a long struggle.
We'll be here forever if we talk about what's normal. No. I mean, can I say something about Melvyn spent many years, and I really would like to get his thoughts on this, living on the street, working on the street, playing, busking. And my sense, but he may contradict this, is that his reasons would have been similar to that drove Diogenes to Diogenes, if I'm not mistaken, I think he died from eating a raw octopus, right? He wanted to know what was going on in his world, that the, if you like, the inner world was going to be compatible with with his environment, and he wasn't going to kid himself. That was a big thing. He said something very funny, actually. Montaigne quoted this. Someone asked Diogenes, what wine is your favourite, or what do you prefer? And he said, somebody else's, which is fantastic. But you know, Diogenes, a cynic, there were two Diogenes, speaking about the cynic, I think of Sinope. He once said, Alexander the Great admired him greatly, actually, for his bluntness, if nothing else. And he was famous to have said, when Alexander said, what might I do for you? And Diogenes said, step out of my light. Get out of the way of my light. He was standing in the way.
All right.
And I just wonder, does that seem an appropriate kind of comparison to make, would you say, with your own adventures and experiences in life?
Well, you've made it. I'm sure it's appropriate, but
because you've been all the time on the street, I'd love to.
Well, it's got me thinking about that, and I'll. My friend John Gould, the viola player, very fine viola player, and a friend from my earliest days, the first AYO I played in, I was deputy principal viola and he was the principal viola. That's where we met, and we had a friendship that went on for 63 years. But he was a great, in latter years, I was actually writing him a viola concerto at the time and travelling up to Canberra to see him, but he was in awe of my ability to play on the streets. Now, I understood this. He said to me, he said, look, Melvyn, I've got this garage in my house which is converted into my music studio. It has this big door. He said, I've stood in the doorway of that garage and tried to play out into the street. He said, Melvyn, I can't do it. Now, I reached a stage, I was in a bit of a crisis in my life anyway, I'd lost the use of my right arm for about 6 years. I couldn't control and play properly. And I was not feeling ready to try and get back into the profession as I had been before. But fortunately, I had once in my youth played on the streets with my friend Alan Lender, who was a very fine violinist. You might have known Alan. And we played the Bach double. And I remember in those days busking was not permitted. We weren't busking. And I remember the policeman twiddling his thumbs behind him, trying to work out whether we were breaking the law or not. But anyway, he let us play the Bach double. This was after one rehearsal of the AYO, or maybe a concert of the AYO on the Princess Bridge there. So way back in my youth, I'd had one experience of playing on the streets. But one reason that I went to play on the streets, apart from the fact that I didn't feel up to anything much else, I wanted to keep playing, but I realised to what extent we classical musicians use the circumstances of performance in a concert hall with a stage and a trapped audience. An audience is going to be there, most of them will be there from the beginning to the end of the concert. That my playing was being shaped by the protective nature of that environment. Mm-hmm. And John's experience that I just described was a very good example of it. He could not take the step. Now, I can't pretend it was easy for me when I got on the streets. I remember particularly one time when your mother, dear Annette, came past, and I'd known for many years and a very close friend, and we'd done lots of music making together. But she found me on the streets, and she was visibly actually terribly embarrassed. She was awkward. Mm-hmm. And I think your dad also, in conversations I had with him, I could see that he felt a bit awkward about the fact that I was playing on the streets. And
well, it's such a strong social statement, inadvertent or otherwise. It's a strong statement.
Yes,
right?
yes.
As far as most people are concerned, sure.
Yes. Well, dare I say something like this? I've come to understand something very special about the nature of the violin. I talked to you a little bit about that before.
Feel free to say it again.
Well, I'll say the bits and pieces that come to my mind, but the prices that are paid for very wonderful violins are just extraordinary historical phenomenon. There's no other musical instrument that attracts that kind of attention, not remotely. No. Now, the nearest it would come would be something if you could prove that you were selling Elvis Presley's guitar, but the guitar as an instrument never assumes anything like that at all.
No.
Now, I just ask anyone who just considers that particular fact to ask themselves, why is the one nearly pristine Stradivari in the world kept in a glass case in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and it is called the Messiah? There is no accident in that. No accident. It would distract me too much to go back over the stuff I was talking before, because I just wanted to highlight that particular thing about it. Now, I discovered things fairly early on with busking. I could stand on the footsteps of Flinders Street Station at a busy period of time with trams clanging their bells coming past in both directions, all four directions, and sirens blaring, lots of traffic and so on. And then one night I was playing, and I was playing quite softly, I think, the Meditation from Thais on the steps there. Someone came up to me and gave me maybe a $5 note and said, "I heard you from the cathedral on the opposite corner, on the other side." There are huge mysteries about sound and about music and the communication with music. And that's one of them. Somehow what I'd ingested about my love of the violin and the sound I was producing, I could play as soft as anything and be heard through all that noise. And that's one thing I have learned. I'm much influenced by, say, Pierre Boulez. He wrote a book, I think, called Silence or something. Anyway, fancy I read something like that. And various other composers and...
Well, John Cage certainly wrote a book called Silence. I don't know about the Boulez, but...
Yeah, right.
Nonetheless.
Well, whatever. It was in the air
Sure.
When I was much younger.
Sure.
And what I realised through watching Pot Black, interestingly enough, on television, when there was the final in Pot Black, say, and the loser was going to get only £100,000, but the winner would get £250,000, that sort of thing. Now, can you imagine the concentration and the focus that was present in that? And yet, I realised that there was this tremendous sense of the palpable presence of silence in the midst of whatever noise was going on, the traffic going on it's outside, the noise, the spattering of the noise that the television sets made in those days and that sort of thing. Silence is present, even in the presence of noise. It's always present. It's the most extraordinary thing. It's one of the unknowns. It's one of the things that I would put in the ragbag of the unknowns that you were talking about earlier on, the great mysteries about music. At any rate, I had a sense of mission about my playing then. I sought, as it were, to cleanse the city of Melbourne. Now, I hope that doesn't sound arrogant, but I felt so confident of what little encouragement that I got, things like that, the way the still small voice, that concept in theology and in Christian thinking, the still small voice of calm, how it can penetrate. And I also observed things like, in a pantomime, there's always the wicked witch or something like that. And there might be a lot of noise going on the stage from all the characters from the play, the wicked witch only has to poke her head from round behind one of the scenes at the back, not make a sound. And yet she is the most palpable presence in that moment. So for that reason, a lot of my music is aimed at bringing the listener to the borderline between sound and silence. And of course we have Simon Garfunkel's Sound of Silence, this wonderful song.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence.
What I'm talking about has been pointed at from all sorts of different directions in music and in theology and in spirituality generally. Now, it's just flashing into my mind. I once did a conducting workshop thing with Graham Abbott, and the first thing he did was ask us to define what I thought the role of the conductor was. And I shocked everybody by saying, well, the conductor's primary role is to hypnotise the orchestra. And I could still see the sort of shockwaves going through the bodies of the people there when I said this.
I wonder what would you think would be the common notion of what a conductor is there for, as far as they would have been concerned? I mean, what answer would they expect? I mean, well, give them directions, I guess.
Yes, so there's a number of different answers, and by that stage there was all sorts of neo-Marxist thinking about, which said that orchestras could dispense with the conductor altogether. And
how does, just on that, seeing you brought out, how does that work with neo-Marxism? Just can you draw the connection for me, because I can't see it immediately. How does that work with the dispensing of the conductor? Because of the notion of them being an authoritarian position?
Yes. The directedness, the authority, part of the paternalism, that sort of thing. And of course, some conductors were like that, and you'd hate, generally hate them. But let me just tell you.
I'll speak freely. I don't have a problem with many aspects of the old-fashioned conductor. I mean, sure, there were Toscanini's tirades and Celibidache's extreme form of dictation, but nonetheless, they often got the most extraordinary results. So I'm not willing to throw it all out with the bathwater.
No.
To speak honestly.
Well, I made the pilgrimage to Munich to see Celibidache in his last years. They're rehearsing with the Munich Philharmonica for a performance of the Mozart Mass in C minor and a Haydn Symphony. And I'd heard all these fearsome stories about Celibidache, like he would come into the orchestra in the opera at Stuttgart, he'd look round and say, "Not that harp player!" And the harp player would be sent away and they'd get another harp player. I'd heard all these dreadful stories about Celibidache, and I didn't know what to expect. Well, his rehearsals were 4 hours duration. They had 2 long breaks with sausages and beers. They were like extraordinary family parties.
Oh, like buffets.
Yes. And one of the trenchant rules in the Australian orchestras was that the conductor was not allowed to talk too much, you see. No, 95% of the rehearsal should be spent playing music and not listening to the conductor talking. Celibidache sat there and talked, and they were all laughing, having a great time. And then he had this baton, which was as crooked as a dog's hind leg. And he would just go, "Und!" to the orchestra like that. And this most wonderful diaphanous sound would come out. And you'd wonder, what is the connection? Oh dear. what an
But
experience.
anyway, I would think a lot of things you've just been speaking about with regard to silence, that was very close to Celibidache's philosophy for music. Very,
Was it?
very, very aligned. Oh, very much. Well, he was very Zen influenced in
Yes.
his own words. Yeah,
Yes.
very much so.
Well, I was going to tell you about probably the most intense experience I had with any conductor ever, and that was with Nikolai Malko, the Russian, who's actually wrote a book and published it on the art of conducting. Now, he believed in the rectangle in front, in the air, and the tip of the baton was confined within that rectangle and made all these shapes in there like that. It was a very strict
Very
way.
geometric.
Yes, and he was a very old man, about my age now. He was in 80 or thereabouts, in his early 80s. He died only a few weeks after I played with him. It was Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony is the part of the program I remember most vividly. But I can never forget this, because with his baton, he was drawing substance. He was hooking. He was like a fisherman hooking up the players, and you'd see this like this substance, like almost a cord coming out from the baton, which would go to the first clarinetist and say, "Ta-dum, ba-dum, 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 ba-da, 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 ba-da-da, ba-da-da." There was a materiality about that conducting that I have never experienced with anyone else. Graham Abbott showed some sign of understanding it a bit, because he gave us exercises with our arms and maybe with a baton in them, in which we imagined we're just flowing through gentle fairy floss, or another one where a baton is going through honey and we're expressing. So he began to introduce various material kind of images to relate. But the very idea that the conductor is there to beat time.
Yes.
No.
This is Benjamin Martin, and this is Ragtime. Melvyn, you brought up something before. It just made me think of, I think, with regard to the intensity, say, within silence, but with regard to, say, the chemical processes, the way they can't be distinguished, right, between the intensity, say, in a performance or a real life or death battle. Sometimes the body responds in the same kind of way, the pulse rate, everything else. And that's what makes it laughable when someone says, when you go out to perform, "Oh, come on, nobody's going to die." It's like, well, try telling my body that, right? You know what I mean? So I just wonder if you have any thoughts, because I find it's a very open-ended thought.
Don't know that I've got anything very linear to say on that, except that it flashed into my mind that perhaps one of the reasons my marriages and my other hopeful ones for marriage failed was perhaps because of my sustained intensity in all matters.
Yeah, I mean, well, since when did intensity become a negative word? It's funny, right? Obsessive, as though that were a negative thing. I've noticed all kinds of things have sort of fallen by the wayside. I'm just being very loose with what I'm saying here, but one thing I've noticed is the word neurotic seems to have disappeared from the vernacular in the last 15 years. Have you noticed that? No one talks about anyone being neurotic anymore. We've got ADHD, autism, all these categories.
Yeah.
Neurotic behaviour? No, not there. Now, why might that be?
Yeah. Well,
As though that's old-fashioned. It's a bit like, the manic-depressive is now bipolar 1 or bipolar 2. Manic-depressive, not there. And that, of course, manic-depressive was probably melancholia once, right? With Berlioz and so forth.
Yes.
Which had a lot more of an evocative quality about it. Melancholia, even the word, strikes a chord that manic-depressive doesn't, and certainly bipolar doesn't, right? I'm not trying to make light of these very serious sets of circumstances for individuals, but nonetheless.
Well, it's
I'm probably bipolar.
reminding me of my long-standing belief that the medieval concepts of demons and exorcism are much more useful in coming to understand psychiatric disorder than anything available in modern times.
Right, go ahead, please, elaborate. This is intriguing.
Well, amongst other things which you haven't mentioned and perhaps not fully aware of, I'm a healer. I've spent a lot of my life, and amongst other things, I became a medicine man and elder of the Wiradjuri tribe in New South Wales because of my healing work. Now I'm having a senior's moment at the moment, trying to remember why I mentioned that. But I have learned that when something comes to interrupt a thought, there's usually a reason for it. But you were talking about intensity. You see, it wasn't in this podcast, was it, that I mentioned to you that I had formed years ago the Melbourne Slow Walkers Society.
Just outside the podcast, but go ahead, because, that was just before we started.
Yes, I thought so, yes. Well, I had made a couple of videos, one of which got shown on SBS and got marketed in Britain and here, on the Alexander technique for musicians. And
did you say Feldenkrais as well? Is that correct? Before, or was it?
I did mention Feldenkrais before.
Just to know, right.
The Feldenkrais I mentioned, I learnt early on, I didn't directly know much about Feldenkrais, but various of my musical friends were involved with it. Alan Lender once, and the Rosefields.
Wow.
They would talk about...
Why that name rings a bell.
That's your mother. Your mother and her sister. Yeah. They were much influenced by Feldenkrais, and I heard about it from them, that the doctrine was that the way to learn to play fast is to practice slowly. So, and of course I'd been studying Chinese medicine. I'm a trained acupuncturist, and with about 5,000 to 8,000 hours of clinical experience treating people with a whole variety of different conditions. It's something to learn. You see, well, the way I used to prepare for exams, various colleagues of mine, or other students at the time, the ones who won Rhodes scholarships and things like that, would go to they were studying law, saying they'd go to the Bar Smith Library in the University of Adelaide and sit there for 8-10 hours of the day reading. If I tried to do that, I just fell asleep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you know how I used to prepare for exams?
No.
I used to go fishing, and I would sometimes have just one book, maybe Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, sitting beside me on the jetty whilst I was fishing. I still have such detailed eidetic memories of those occasions, the waves coming past the shoals of fish in the water, absolutely eidetic memories of that. Mm. And I've just this book sitting beside me, and I might only read 1 or 2 paragraphs in the course of a day. Later in my life, I came across a gardener on one of those gardening programs on television who said, look, the novice gardeners always make the mistake. They get a parcel of seedlings and they go and they plant them too close together with no room to grow, to become what they can become. And I believe that my academic success came from the fact that I did not study intensively. I did not put in lots and lots of hours of study in a library. There one time in my life when I did what everybody told me I needed to do to get anywhere on the violin was you've just got to do the hard grind. And we have this dreadful phrase, the hard grind. I mean, why not? Particularly if you're a musician, why not the pleasurable grind?
You mentioned the library. I remember, for what it's worth, in my experience, I learnt next to nothing in high school, and even in Juilliard, very little outside of what I was interested in. In fact, that's always been the case. Most of my real learning outside of musical subjects was actually post my college years. And you mentioned the library because I did used to like visiting the Victorian State Library. I think it was on the first or second floor, the Dome Reading Room.
Yes.
Because it was a sensual experience.
Yes.
So as long once they refurbished the place, it had fluorescent lighting. I couldn't go near it.
No,
but
that's right.
the sensual experience, very basic things, but that smell of the old books,
Yes.
the smell of learning in that
Yes,
sense
yes.
is surely glorious.
Well, that's what's
and that's when you actually do learn.
Yes, exactly. Well, Oxford is so much full of that sort of thing. I mean, just to walk, I was at New College in Oxford for 3 years as a student on a British Council scholarship, and just to walk the quadrangle of New College, it wasn't just the knowledge that had been walked by Erasmus,
Still, it doesn't hurt.
but there was this feeling, this emanation from the place itself. And, well, if I ask myself about what my peak learning experiences were, I remember one occasion when I was struggling with octaves on the violin, playing parallel octaves, really struggling, getting nowhere with it. And I went to a recital by Ruggiero Ricci. Now, his story, for those who don't know it, is quite remarkable, really, because he was a child prodigy violinist, most extraordinary one, but he was involved in a very serious accident in his life, and he was hospitalised, I think, for many months, barely able to move, but he was able to practice the violin, develop his technique, and restore himself playing the violin in bed. Now, I went to a concert where he played only Paganini Caprices. I came home and I could play the octaves. It was as simple as that. And in a place like Oxford, there were so many wonderful, genuine scholars around whose very presence was a source of knowledge. It's what I was talking about earlier about the knowledge as the intimacy, intimacy and the intimacy of being without words. It doesn't have to have words. It's communicated, it's there. And if you're open to it, you just absorb it.
How does that, or does that contrast in your experience quite sharply with, say, the modern age in terms of your experiences in Oxford and academia now?
Oh, yes. Well, I got out of the universities because I could see the terrible way they were going. In the good old days, it was like this. As a student in the university, it was seen that you were given a great deal of freedom of time to develop your own thinking, to participate in extracurricular activities like the drama society, the debating society, and so on, as well as sporting things. And throughout the year you'd be given in a subject maybe only 3 assignments, 3 essay assignments, and these didn't count at all towards your final result. So you were perfectly free to try your arm.
Oh, freedom.
Writing whatever. Yes, freedom was a big thing. And it worked. It was fabulous. That's how
I'm not surprised, by the way. I'm not surprised it worked.
But by the time I left the universities, new students straight from high school were being required to write essays of, say, 1,000 words within 3 weeks of enrolling in a philosophy subject that was going to count 5% towards their final result.
Yes.
No thought about the need to process ideas, assimilate them, absorb them. Again, it's this thing. It's the same fault that I the gardener's fault of planting the seedlings too close together.
Yes.
The universities are horrendous now.
Reminds me, there's probably every reason why Bertrand Russell wrote in praise of idleness. I mean, but this is the thing. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a correlation between what I was mentioning much earlier about. Well, wasn't that long ago, but with regard to television, the need to deliver from the hip, the notion that when you're preparing for exams, you sort of flood your brain with as much knowledge as you can, but it's generally superficially taken in because a week later you forget all of it. Right, so there's probably, I wouldn't be surprised, is what I'm saying, there's a correlation there, whereas when you assimilate things naturally, slowly, it's actually not so slow, but
it's not.
Because, and Montaigne put this beautifully, and it also refers to what I said earlier about the apparent slowness of great thinkers, but actually it's deceptive, because as he said, my memory is like a sieve. I'm very, very slow often to grasp things, but he said when I do, it's lightning quick and with a complete comprehensive understanding at once. And I think that's almost always the case with the greatest thinkers. Well, once they get it, they absolutely get it. It's not going to... I think it's actually true with most people if they gave themselves a chance.
Well, I think so.
So it's not diffuse. There's a nature of completion to what they're doing, and in terms of their own life as well. It's completely intertwined with their existential circumstances, not just something separate. Yeah.
Yes. Well, sometimes people ask me. I had my 84th birthday recently, and there was a bit of a family dinner with some of my family there, and I'm asked now, and in your 84th year now, what would you most like to say to pass on to the world, Melvyn? as though I'm in any kind of position to look at a smorgasbord of all the things that I might say. And I can only ever say what's at the top of the pile. I love that story, about how do you sort out papers. You throw them down from the top of the stairs and you deal with the one that's on the top of the pile. Well, I think it's part of the life of faith and trust, to be honest. It's not a joke. With your own mind, when you're improvising on the piano, you have to trust whatever decision you make and stand by it with whatever notes or chords or whatever gestures you make. You have to learn immediate trust, stand by it. And as far as possible, I try to lead my life like that. And what amazes me every time I do record perhaps an extended improvisation on the piano, and all I'm thinking about is, I'm mostly thinking only about the expressive nature of the movements I'm bringing, because the piano is, the gifts are already there. That piano is just so wonderful. Yeah. If you go at it with savageness, it gives you savageness back. If you go with tenderness, if you stroke it tenderly, it comes back to you. If you shape it this way, it shapes this way.
Well, you mentioned, that, by the way, that you were talking about the violin, and just outside of the discussion here, you were talking about the physical form of the violin and the connection with the human body. You might like to talk about that again, but with the piano, even though it's not quite so physically sculpted as an instrument, nonetheless, it's an astonishing, I always think, invention. The fact that the relationships of the black and white keys can be so suited to almost every physiology, right? Notwithstanding that some can't quite reach the octave. Okay, there's a few, but generally speaking, it's just an astonishing invention. Yeah. I mean, how it assimilates with our human form like that. I find it extraordinary and really difficult to improve upon, to be honest, for quite a period now. Yes. So I mean, it's these. You're right. I mean, I never. There's nothing more extraordinary in a way, and that includes. It's a big thing to say, but even whether it's the keyboard music of Bach, I mean, the piano itself, nothing supersedes it. It's extraordinary. I mean, the same with the violin, right? Just the magnificence of their invention.
Yes.
It's extraordinary. But
well, as far as the violin, you a couple of times sort of invited me to go back to some of the things I said to you before about the nature of the violin. Your father, as you know, was a great lover of the violin, not just as a player, but as an instrument.
Oh, I think he loved it just as much as the playing.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
He had a
yes.
deep passion for that.
He was a collector, and I collected violins. Neither of us ever had a Strat or a Guarneri, but I got to know collectors of violins who I did manage to move in some of those circles.
And Dan had something of a carpenter's temperament, actually, I should say. Something of that, but go ahead, sorry. For people who wouldn't know Chris. But
Yes. I've still got a handful of moderately good instruments, good enough to be interesting. In more recent years, I would go take them into a school. I've been invited in to play and something. I'd bring half a dozen violins with me, and I'd hold them up either to a school or maybe it was a workshop, a healing workshop I was giving. Not people who are musically oriented at all, but I'd just hold them up one after another and ask them what they saw. And I'd get responses, well, it's like a guitar, or it's got 4 strings, responses like that. No one ever said what I believe to be the truth, that the violin is a sculpture of the human form, and that the reason the great masters were great masters of making the violin because they were great sculptors of human personality. Now, as I said to you earlier, I have utter contempt for those studies that seek to compare ancient instruments of huge value with modern instruments, and the players stand behind a screen and there's an adjudication, and all they're doing is listening to the sound of the instruments. In other words, they're setting up an essentially non-musical situation in which to evaluate a musical instrument. As I said to you, Ben, you don't go to a concert to hear the wonderful tone qualities of Richard Tognetti's Guarneri's Still Jesu. You go to become transported, invaded by the music, transported, uplifted, changed. You go for something else. I mean, you might enjoy it. You might incidentally notice, I mean, I can recall the wonderful tone qualities of instruments that Menuhin played, and because I shared the concert platform with him and with Stern and Alfredo Campoli and various other of the great violinists of the 20th century. And I can recall vividly the wonderful, you might say the sound of their instruments, but it's more like this. With Henrik Schering, he played the Brahms Concerto with us. So we performed it 3 times with him. I just remember the transcendence. I remember, if you like, the sound, but it's in the context of the transcendent playing of this. Play it like that these days.
It reminded me when you said earlier about Wittgenstein's Tractatus, drawing this into relation for a moment. There's one of the most striking passages, but I can't remember it verbatim. But he was talking about how the score, the conductor, and was it maybe the orchestra as well? No, the score, the conductor, and the gramophone come into relation. They're in a way inextricably linked things. That was the basic tenet of what he was saying. You can't separate them, and I think that's the thing, right? When we're separating the notion of the instrument from the sound and making them into components, there's a perversity in that.
Yes.
It's perverse. It's again what I mentioned with Adorno talking about. There's a certain fetish element in there as well. We're fetishizing something which is greater than its sum of parts in a way. It's which when you pull it into parts, it isn't. It is no longer greater than its sum of parts.
Well, I was reflecting on that with you, with those makers in my time who we've lived through a period of what you might call scientific reductionism, trying to reduce everything to scientific language. And
it's a huge please. Yeah.
They were doing it with the violin. So a dear friend of mine, Rob Collins, he made quite lovely violins, but he used to, if he'd take the plates and he'd put iron filings in them and vibrate them and see what patterns emerged. And later on, I saw people hooking up the plates, and I've read about taking the plates off Stradivarius and Guarnerius and that, or when they've been off, hooking them up to an oscilloscope and seeing a display of the frequency. Yeah,
that was I mentioned the Chladni, I think Chladni, that with the metal plates, rub the bow and you get these. It is beautiful, the symmetries. I think I've got the name.
Yes.
Anyway.
Well, I mean, that's all interesting discovery. I don't put it to one side, but it goes absolutely nowhere to understanding.
No.
You see, and I've told this story a few times, but at the time I was a student of Lajos Jasek, the Czech violinist, and he was playing the Beethoven with the South Australian Symphony Orchestra. I was in the viola section, and Rob was the deputy principal viola, and Lajos played one of Rob's violins, and he thought, this sounds wonderful. I'm going to use this for my performances of the Beethoven this week. Well, he used it for the first performance. It was a complete disaster, because particularly when it came to the slow movement, you know. He couldn't do it. It's not the sound that the instrument makes, it's what you can do with it that counts. And because the great ones are human personalities, the nearest I had to a really great violin was one by Niccolo Bergonzi, the grandson of Carlo Bergonzi and son of Michelangelo Bergonzi. About 1790, I bought it from Beers, and I came to call it my harlot, because it had such a will of its own. I couldn't, if I was trying to play a late Beethoven string quartet or something like that, it just wouldn't go where I wanted. It had its own voice. And so I often preferred another violin made by my dear friend John Furwider, but I commissioned this instrument from him many years ago, over 50 years ago now. I've still got it. And he entered it in an international competition in New York, and it won fourth place. It was highly commended after the first three winners, first, second and third prize in the competition. But relative to the Bergonzi, it was it didn't have a really strong voice of its own. I could do what I wanted with it.
Yes.
I could, in a way, the same problems arise in your relationship to your violin and even to your piano too. I'm sure you're aware of that.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
I can't relate to this one, or I can relate to that one.
Absolutely.
Shall I tell you about that piano?
In one moment, we're just going to have a little break. This is Ragtime. Do tell me about that piano.
Yes.
Melvyn has a piano here in his wonderful studio. He's got some much better mics than I have in the piano as well.
Yes, well, I treated myself recently to 2 Neumann mics. I'd always wanted them. And so they're sort of 10 grand each, that sort of thing. But be that as it may, I'm not bragging about that. I got them for half price in a sale. But
Still.
and
Beautiful.
same with
they're aesthetically beautiful.
Yes, they are.
They are.
Yes. And the piano itself, it's a Shigeru Kawai. I'm touched to see that Michael Kieran Harvey has a Shigeru Kawai and is a great advocate for the piano.
He's been a great advocate for many things, very dynamic personality.
Yes. I've got to know him in recent years, and I wish I'd got to know him much earlier in my life. He's a great character and a great musician. But at any rate, Allen's, the big music store, went broke. And there was a fire sale. I went along. I was looking actually to see if there was a very fine microphone, a better quality microphone than the ones I had that might be being sold for half price or something. But the microphone room was right next door to where they had the pianos. So I went in and I tried about half a dozen really fine pianos, a Feurich, a Yamaha, and however clumsy some of the early Yamahas might have been, some of the best ones are really wonderful too.
Sure.
No question about that.
When they're not motorbikes.
yes, that's right.
Because, I mean, the thing with Yamahas, they're highly durable. That seems to be unfortunately, often their chief characteristic. You could drop them 30 feet, they'll still work. That's not what you want from a piano.
Well, whatever.
But I have played a couple of decent Yamahas. So.
Whatever, I was thinking, because these pianos were all marked down dramatically, from prices like $125,000 to $30,000, $30,000, that sort of thing. And I thought, I had all this sort of funny thing with my mother about asking her for money ever. And we're asking her for anything really. And so I remember I came home from trying about half a dozen of these pianos. And I sat here in this room and I said, Melvyn, do you actually want any one of those pianos enough to ring up your mother and ask her to buy it for you? The answer was no. So I went back in again. I thought, well, I'll have another look at all the microphones they're selling off. And I drifted into the piano room again, and I hadn't noticed this Shigeru Kawai. The first time I was there, I sat down, I played it for about 10 seconds, and this voice inside me said, Melvyn, this is your piano. This is your piano. You must have it. This
Simple as that.
Springs out as the question of relationship to things. It's like falling in love at first sight, you know. I must have that. And so I rang up my mother and I asked her if it was $56,000 instead of $125,000. I asked my mother if she'd buy it for me. And she said yes on the spot.
But that probably wouldn't have happened if you hadn't had the presence of mind to know what you didn't want in the first instance, right?
Possibly, yes.
They tend to go together, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you're very clear in your thinking about what you want.
It's been a revelation because it's amongst the very best pianos I've ever played, and I've played quite a few. I mean, I made a recording, interestingly enough, it was in British Grove Studios in London. I made a CD there on their piano. I went in. Do you know what it was? It was about a 70 or 80-year-old Bösendorfer grand, huge long one that had belonged to some Mick Jagger or some rock star or something like that. Had a bit of a history going with it, and the keys were so warm.
They're tractors often, those instruments. They're so heavy. I call them tractors because they're heavy. But
yes.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes.
Notoriously
but
heavy.
I remember the black keys were so worn that you had to be careful you didn't slide off the edge if you played them, you know. But it was the most wonderful piano. And I listened back to the recordings I made on that piano, and I think,
Can be beautiful sound. I want to. You mentioned before. You mentioned something about scientific reductionism.
Yes.
And I just wonder, very generally speaking, if being that that's been the pattern, and you know a lot about this too, with regard to the pattern of psychiatry, psychology, wanting to make it fit into the box of a science with all the empirical data supporting it. It seems to me that music, to some degree, as in the business of musical profession, suffered a similar fate, at least thus far, over the course of the last 80, 90 years, whereby we've wanted to make it fit with science. And that, you know, and this reductionism, as you mentioned, that seems to be a consequence of that, let's just put it nicely, over-eagerness to make it fit within that spectrum. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Well,
I mean, it's such a big subject.
it brings out stuff that I find quite important to talk about.
Sure.
But at the risk of coming in for some attitudinal criticism.
Oh, don't worry about it.
But I was in a university. I was appointed there. There was no music department. For 5 years, I created a tremendous amount of music on the campus. I told you I had 2 choirs, a big one and a small one, and an instrumental group, small one, and augmented it for bigger things. We did St. John's Passion by Bach, for example, which, of course, the important thing about mentioning this is that the music that I did involved members of the collegiate members of the university were part of this whole scene. They were singing in my choirs and coming to my concerts. And
well, that sounds positive so far.
Yes, that's right.
Where does it get negative?
Well, so because I've done that, I was commissioned to convene the committee to establish a music department. So I convened the committee and wrote the reports on which the music department was established. They appointed Keith Humble as the incumbent professor. Now, I've talked to you about him before, and I know I always feel I need to guard myself by contextualising by saying that I thought early on, when I first heard Keith Humble's music, many years before when he was a much younger man, that I regarded him as perhaps the most gifted of the contemporary Australian composers.
Well, and I'd second that in terms of him as a composer. He wrote a very fine sonata, influenced obviously by that sort of Darmstadt serialism, but nonetheless, very,
Yes. So, I had my own way of liking and feeling affection towards Keith, but, and it's a big but, he imposed structuralism, the philosophy of structuralism, on all his music students. Music was to be conceived only as a sound structure in space-time, and the only language you could use to talk about it intelligently was analytical structural language.
There's the box.
Yes.
There's the box.
Now, his improvisation groups, for example, were not permitted to improvise on any emotional or spiritual scenario. Now, I was teaching philosophy of music.
So formalism at its extreme.
Yes, extreme.
In a word,
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was the doctrine. I mean, he as a man went quite a lot beyond that, really, but nonetheless, he was fixated by that, and I think he was under the influence of Pierre Boulez, particularly in that respect. But be that as it may, what I'm leading to say is this, that I was teaching philosophy of music and music composition amongst other philosophy subjects in logic and mathematical logic and philosophy of science. And every year I would have maybe between a dozen and 20 students in my class, and there'd be a handful of them, more than a handful were music students, but some of those, we begin by telling one another why I was giving the course, why they had joined the course, and so on. And every year I had 2 or 3 students from the music department with the following story. Before I came to La Trobe University Music Department, I could write music. I've been a student here now for 2 years and I can't write music anymore. And I thought I knew the reason, because in my course they were permitted to follow any kind of philosophical assumptions that they wanted. They were required to analyse and feel what is the driving force behind my music. They were required to write works, compose pieces that we could actually perform in the classes using the resources we had there. But they were required, after we would perform them, and then afterwards each member of the class would talk about, again, this goes back to a doctrine that was imparted to me when I was first a music student in a university, when I was to write essays on music or musical history, that no kind of personal responses were so variable that they were regarded as irrelevant, had to be treated as irrelevant. And I was not allowed to. So they were allowed to do anything they like, follow any kind of philosophical or emotional or spiritual pathway they wanted in their pieces. But we would then, having played the pieces, we would then each give our personal responses to it. Not structural language, but just how was this music affecting us? Yes. And then the composer would tell us what their philosophical background was and what they were trying to impart.
I mean, it's really like, you were very much, it's very Erasmus-like, right? Very humanitarian.
Yeah.
That's what it is. And Keith Humble, I knew him from early music camps, and he was a brilliant pianist and a witty fellow, but it sounds like a bit of a sad story with him in that respect, because I know, and we know this, that whole Darmstadt school and influence was profoundly negative in many respects. We had composers like Ligeti who said as much in the 60s that, if you didn't conform to what was regarded as what was relevant, well, you were just a nostalgic fool. Yeah. You weren't going to be taken seriously. This influence of Boulez in particular was incredibly pervasive.
Mm.
And again, it's this intellectualism, I suppose, and that had everything to do with this reductionism. And when you adopt a more humanitarian, and it's this supposed divide, isn't it, between the subjective and the objective, isn't it? And subjectivism, what's all that? Oh, that's all that foggy dream stuff. Yes. That, we can discard that with yesterday's trash. It just became that reductionism, incredibly cruel assessment of our condition in a variety of ways, which I don't know if we're still climbing up the same branch, certainly with regard to determinism. These are big subjects, but I'm just being very general. But it's been a poison of sorts. In terms of polluting the humanitarian impulses of human beings, I think, over the course of the 20th century.
Yes.
Sorry to land you with all that, but I'm just
you've got nothing to be sorry for at all. But I do want to tell you one story from that time, from one of my classes, because it points back to what I introduced at the beginning of this podcast, your introduction of attention to the unknown. Now, one of my students was Peter Musaferiadis. Now, he is a wonderful guy, and he has a company. I've lost its name at the moment, but at any rate, it's concerned with world peace and cultural peace, cultural understanding across the world. He's won all sorts of awards and assists on all sorts of international committees with regard to the arts and world peace and so on. But in those days, nothing like that had happened to him. He was of Greek Orthodox extraction, and he was involved with the Greek Orthodox Church in the Victoria Parade. I think he was conducting the choir and writing odd pieces for the choir there. But when he came to presenting his piece in the class, under the sort of format I was telling you about, where he had to work out his philosophical orientation, what he was trying to do, and then listen to the responses and so on. So he wrote it for me to play on the violin. I think there was only one other player who was a percussionist. He had timpani and cymbals and a few things like that. And I remember looking at the score, and it was very, it looked like almost nothing. It looked almost like just a bit like Spiegel im Spiegel, just a G major scale going up. Of Arpeggiat, you know that one. Yes. And I sort of groaned a little bit inwardly and thought, well, what am I going to do with this? Yeah. And so I started playing it. And I can tell you this, Ben, I had an experience that I could never forget. In fact, the sad thing is I do forget it from time to time because it's so profound. As I was playing it, I felt this light descending upon me and entering me and enveloping me and filling the whole room, this light, as I played this piece of Peter Musafiriadis. Wow. And we came to talk about it, and of course I had to tell the students that's what I experienced. They all had their bit. I can't remember what they said, but I do know that contrary to the expectations that everybody's says something different, even if they say something different, invariably you could see a common thread through it. Invariably they all seem to relate to the music. But Peter then told us what he'd sought to do. I don't know how familiar you are with the beginning of the Gospel according to St. John, but it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, full of grace and truth. He said, I wanted to express that. And I played this seemingly nothing piece on the paper, and this light descended upon me. I can't tell the story now, as you can tell, without being overcome completely. This is from the world of the unknown.
Yes.
It's not to be underestimated. Not at all.
And it way transcends craft.
Yes.
Or anything like that.
Yes.
It's just the purity of his aspirations.
And mind you, I feel the same often looking at some scores of Beethoven, particularly the later string quartets, and you look at a particular bar and you think, oh, couldn't you have thought up something better to do there? That's just a scale going up. You listen to the piece, and it's the most monumental moment in the piece, and you have absolutely no idea why.
I have that same experience with, if you mentioned Beethoven, just say one piece, the slow movement of the Opus 127, E flat. Mm-hmm. I can't listen to that without falling to pieces. I just can't.
Yes.
It's too much for me.
Yes.
And as long as the performance is good enough. It's just. I don't know why. I don't know why, but that movement in particular, and even more than there are all of them. I mean, Opus 132, sure, but that one is just something I do not understand. But I cannot. I remember I went to a concert. I heard this reasonably good quartet here, ad hoc group, play it, and they started that movement. I hadn't heard it for a long time, and I was falling apart. I was feeling I was making a scene. I was trying terribly hard not to, but I was falling apart. Much more so than you felt you were just before. I was just falling to pieces. And I looked around. I couldn't see it affecting anyone quite that way. But it's sort of, it's completely visceral. I don't know. To talk about music like a movement like that and say it's profound, or you need to know anything about anything to be absolutely torn to pieces by something like that. I don't know why you need any prior knowledge.
Beethoven said or wrote, music is the highest philosophy.
Yeah.
Look, even just you reminding me of it, because I've played that a number of times.
I bet. Is that movement particular for you too, in some respects? Does that movement also...
Well, if it did, I wouldn't have been able to play it. But it affects me now, just the memory of it, just you telling me about it, and us sharing notes about this. Now, this is part of what I'm trying to talk about, the intimacy of our lives as musicians. I had that with your parents, I have it with you, and we have to be prepared to let ourselves be overcome in the way that this is overcoming. Can I tell you one other story?
Please do.
One other story.
Please do.
In my first concert performance, I was 14, and I played 3 pieces attributed or otherwise arranged to Fritz Kreisler. His arrangement particularly of the piece that's just called Melodie by Gluck from the opera Orpheus and Eurydice. And it's a flute piece in the opera, and I know I don't need to rehearse the story with you, but for the purposes of this explanation, part of the story is Eurydice has died, is down in Hades, and Orpheus makes the trip down to implore Pluto to let her come back. And he permits her to come back to life on one condition, that as Orpheus, is walking out of Hades, he will not look back to see if Eurydice is following him. And it's while Orpheus is doing that walk that this flute piece is played, Melodie by Gluck. Now, I played it in my first concert performance. I must say one memorable thing was the review I got, where it said that Melvyn Cann played a Kreisler-esque bracket with wonderful freedom of tone and intonation. That was John Horner. Now, unlike Felix Werder, he was such an affable man, he could say the most outrageous things and be loved for it. And I wasn't at all upset.
That's very good. It's very cavalier.
Oh dear, anyway. But now that piece forever became my mother's favourite of all the pieces that I played. And whenever I would visit her in Adelaide, something like that, I'd play it for her. And it was always our special piece. There was a huge intimacy between my mother and that music. Now, I was in Oxford as a student on this scholarship. I was there for 3 years. And I was due to give a recital in the village where I was living at the end of the week on a Saturday. On the Tuesday, I went up to Oxford to hear a concert at South Australia House. And there were, of course, as you might expect, a number of South Australians there. This woman came up to me and she said, "Oh yes, I saw your mother recently and I'm sorry to hear that she's been so ill." Now, I had already been feeling for 3 months, I hadn't heard from her mother and I hadn't contacted her. I was preoccupied and all that sort of thing. But I sensed that there was something wrong. And so this woman came up to me and she said, "I'm sorry to hear that your mother's been so ill." So I got back to Oxford with my mother very much on my mind. Now, these are the stories you don't tell when you're writing a doctoral thesis in an academic institution. But I can tell you this, so formative and so profound. Because what happened was this. I got back to Oxford. My mother being very much on my mind, as an encore in the recital I was giving, I played the one from Orpheus and Eurydice, which is about bringing the dead back to life. And here I am, concerned. I didn't know how seriously my mother was ill or not. And so I played it that night on the Saturday, and the next day I wrote an aerogram to her telling her that I'd played this piece thinking of her because I'd heard that she'd not been well. Now, it's another one of the stories. It's very hard for me to tell it, but it's very real, so real. My mother on the same day wrote to me an aerogram. Our aerograms crossed in the mail, in which she described an extraordinary experience she had on that Sunday morning. In other words, roughly the same time.
When you
yes,
played it.
Extraordinary experience. She said she didn't know whether she was awake or asleep, but it seemed about 6 o'clock in the morning or something. I don't know what time it was. I was standing in the doorway of her room. This is on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah,
14,000 miles away.
In my heavy overcoat, saying, "Mum, you must come to church with me this morning." She said, well, I hadn't been to church for months because I hadn't been well enough to go. But her phrase was, wild horses wouldn't have kept me away that day. So she said she went to church. In a musical interlude, before the sermon, a flautist played Melodie by Gluck. Our letters crossed in the mail.
That's extraordinary.
This is the unknown.
That's extraordinary. That is the unknown.
We know it, but we don't honour it enough. We do not honour it enough. I don't honour it enough. The mere fact that I'm so overcome again, I have to live my life not being overcome like this.
But that's But that's an astonishing story,
Yes.
and it's worthy of the emotive accompaniment, if you like, because it's astonishing. I've never heard anything like that.
Yes.
Look, Melvyn, thanks so much for spending your time on this, what has been to me a very, very precious show and occasion. And I want to wish you all the best also for your soon-to-be travels.
Yes.
For your new, might you just quickly say a word about that? Is that to Brazil? With
Yes.
your new work?
Yes. Well, earlier this year I had the privilege of being selected to write a work for the National Orchestra, or it's more properly called the Orchestra of Claudio Santoro, because it's been renamed. It was the National Orchestra, it was renamed because of Claudio Santoro, the conductor and composer who formed the orchestra. At any rate, to write a work for what's called the Brasilia Orchestral Summit at the end of July.
That's fantastic news.
Yes. I looked at it was one of those extraordinary things, again, from the unknown. I mean, why and how was it? I wasn't looking for anything like that. Heavens, dare I say, I'm 84, I'm suffering from what's called congestive heart failure. I'm not expected to be doing as well as I'm doing. My heart function has been actually improving, which is not supposed to happen. But nonetheless, a voice inside me said, Melvyn, I looked at this application thing and I said, Melvyn, pity this didn't come in 30 or 40 years ago when you've got the strength to go and do it. And then not long afterwards, another voice inside me said, Melvyn, if anyone's going to disqualify you from doing this, don't let it be you.
Right, well, I just want to say on that note what Nietzsche said, something to this effect. When the will is involved, the why, as in the motivation to do something, will overcome almost anyhow.
Well, that seems to be happening.
Yeah.
And I'm travelling to Brazil. I've got a friend coming with me whom I've actually tutored as a composer. He became a composer under my guidance, Martin Schroeder. But I realised I couldn't travel on my own, so I felt I couldn't anyway. And I thought, no, I've got to do this and just see what effect this decision against all the. I mean, what do they hold out for us with at my age? Stroke, dementia, etc., heart attack, embolism.
But there's no saying. Leonard Bernstein, I think they wrote him off with his emphysema, chronic emphysema, about 25 years before he so thank you so much, Melvyn, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and I'm sure listeners have.
Yes.
Thank you so much. You have been listening to Ragtime.